this very intrusive type of satellite technology, which is ordinarily reserved for government use in times of war.
So, do you know at this point why she was being targeted? Because this is obviously the question that always comes up. I never doubt that these things are going on, but the most curious aspect to me almost is, why are certain people picked, so to speak? What's your take on that, John?
Well, at least in our case here in San Antonio, Texas, the reason for the targeting of her was purely for sexual assault. Now, in the bigger picture of things, I'm on the medical committee with an organization called Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance. This is a human rights group based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States, that has dedicated themselves to fighting this type of technology, and it's given victims a place where they can talk to other victims. We've done studies through Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance, surveys to determine what patterns of victimization are going on, if there are any common threads among victims, and it seems to be random. Most of the victims are women, most of them that have experienced sexual assault, but as far as them being whistleblowers, them being former government agents, or radicals of any type, we're not seeing any trends in that fashion, nor race, nor religion. It appears that, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, there are several former DARPA scientists that I have talked to, that it appears that the government has released access to this technology to certain criminal groups in every state in the U.S., and has basically given them carte blanche to victimize whoever they want, while the government sits back and just take notes on the success. So it's not the government directly, in most cases, that are victimizing these people, but it's a criminal element. In this case, it was a private investigative group that's owned and operated by a former FBI agent in San Antonio, and his son, who's a former lieutenant colonel with our Department of Defense. So both of them had access to the technology. Both of them had clearances to get access to the technology. Now they're victimizing whoever they want to victimize, or whoever they're hired to victimize, maybe not even realizing that they're part of a larger experiment themselves.
So do you think that we're seeing the initial steps of this, that they're beginning to testing the technology, but they don't do the dirty work themselves, so to speak? They hand it out to someone else.
Well, that's exactly it. And if you look back at some of the original mind control studies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, termed MK-Ultra, which I'm sure you've heard about.
Yep.
In MK-Ultra, almost all of the studies were done through front companies. Now, the term for front company now, at least in our country, is agency sterile. An agency sterile operation is one in which the technology is sold or given surreptitiously to criminal groups. So when they do get caught, in such as the case in San Antonio, you're actually catching a private investigative group that's using the technology to victimize people. Well, it's still government technology, and they still got their hands on it, but it's not linked directly back to the NSA or the CIA, although it is their technology. And it appears that there are a certain faction of the public is currently being used as guinea pigs, possibly using this technology on everyone eventually.
So, do you know at this point if there's a specific satellite system that is being used for this purpose alone?
Well, I'm sure there is, and there are other PhDs that have been doing research into this that think it might be a multimodality type of system. Some of it's coming from satellite, possibly some of it is coming from HARP. Certainly, it's easy enough to track someone via their cell phone now. But so their current thinking is that some of the tracking could possibly be getting done through cell phone use or Gwen towers. Some of the behavioral changes can obviously be done using HARP in a broad sense. It's my understanding that HARP cannot be directed very specifically at individuals, but it certainly can broadcast extremely low frequency waves over a large area to incite behavioral changes. And then using satellite for its directed energy component and for its imaging. So
how would it work more specifically? We'll look at some of the examples of their attempts to, let's say, influence someone, disrupt them. Of course, spy on them is easy these days in terms of cell phones or tapping into microphones and cameras that are on laptop and desktop computers, etc. So we know that that's going on in one sense if they feel so inclined to target somebody. But how about if we talk about the mind control aspects of this? How would you go about explaining that for listeners who might not be familiar, how the technology and basically how the technology is being used to do this and pull this off, John?
Well, the human brain is essentially an electrical system. It operates on a very narrow frequency range, and what they've developed and have been attempting to develop since the 60s is frequency modulation ways to change behavior. And there are several theories of thought on exactly how they're doing this. One is using microwave hearing to control people. In our country, there was a researcher in the 60s named Alan Frey, or Frey, F-R-E-Y, who noticed that certain individuals around radar installations could tell when the radar came off and on. They would hear popping and crackling in their head. Well, this is called the microwave hearing effect. Now, the Army and most of the other intelligence agencies took advantage of this to figure out how to communicate with people in their head via the microwave auditory effect or the Frey effect. An important document that was released through our Freedom of Information Act was the Army's addendum to the bioeffects of non-lethal weapons, and that came out in 1996. This was a study where they were able to piggyback other waves with the microwave energy directed directly at the skull to cause communication inside one's head. And in their study, they specifically state to imagine the deleterious effects on an enemy combatant when they begin to hear voices in their head that are not their own. This came directly from the Army. They also mentioned the value of this type of effect in a hostage situation where you can communicate with the hostage or the hostages or the hostage takers directly in their head without the other one hearing. And they go on to state how that it can't be recorded, that even with microphones in the ear or microphones on the scalp, that the communicated sound via the microwave auditory effect cannot be recorded. So that's one person that's going to hear what you're broadcasting to them when no one else around them can, which is exactly what we're seeing in these victims. Almost all of the victims are claiming someone's watching me, they're telling me what I'm doing, they're telling me where I'm at, they're telling me my thoughts, and I'm communicating back to them without speaking out loud. Well, if you hear voices in your head that are not your own, that's very obviously harassment. But they mimic your own voice. You know, as we read, any one of us, you hear your own little voice in your head as you read a sentence. Well, if they put a voice in your head that sounds like your own voice, well, then that becomes a artificial thought, an artificial thought. And many people will act on those thoughts, and then you have control.
Absolutely. I'm reminded here as well of the new ad gimmick that I've been testing and using, which also is using, I think, similar or if not, the exact same technology to project ad messages to people that are walking by on the street. I think this was done over in the States. I'm reading as we talk right here now. Are you familiar with that story? Do you remember that, John?
Yes, I am. And actually, the original technology for that started in Japan, and I haven't seen it in person, but I understand that we do have some soft drink vending machines now that, as long as you're in the correct line of sight, they're using a digital silent sound spectrum, DSSS, to where the advertisement is beamed directly into the patron's head when they stand in a certain spot in front of the drink machine.
That's just crazy. So, the obvious thing right there is how to prevent something like that from happening. Okay, granted, if we're aware of it, if it's out there as an ad or something, it's still intrusive, obviously, but then it's at least, in many cases, we can fairly quickly, understand where it comes from and so forth. But this other kind of harassment that you're talking about is much more subtle and much more detrimental and much more terrorizing in that sense. Is there anything we can do to protect us from that kind of technology, John?
Well, at this current time, really, knowledge is your best protection. What's happening in our country, and I'm assuming what's happening in other countries, is when you begin to hear voices in your head and someone's describing your your place in your house or what you're doing or what you're thinking, immediately you know you're under some type of surveillance. Well, inevitably,